The research inspired by the network of ley hunters Moot in Oxford in May 2016 showed that there seems to be an association between ley alignments found by several different people, including Alfred Watkins, the discoverer of the ley system, and the serpentine energy currents associated with the Spine of Albion. These, discovered by Caroline Hoare and Gary Biltcliffe, follow curving paths around the parent alignment, seemingly seeking similar ancient sites to those occurring on leys. At the following moot in Stratford-upon-Avon in September 2016, some of the leys previously found were extended there, and with another found by Alfred Watkins, was found to have even more association with the curving currents. At the moot, Caroline and Gary showed how the currents have an inexplicable relationship with places in Stratford-on-Avon associated with poet and playwright William Shakespeare. There seems to be an even more enigmatic relationship with the stars of the constellation Cygnus, the Swan. Gary and Caroline gave an outline of this at the Moot tour in Stratford-on-Avon. This started at the parish church of Holy Trinity, which is a nodal point of the two energy currents which have been named Belinus and Ellen. He began by speaking of the Clopton family associated with Shakespeare.
And these are the people we think were behind the Shakespeare conspiracy, because it's following the trail of clues. It was the Cloptons who sold the house to Shakespeare, which probably cost about £2 million today. So Shakespeare found that money through acting.
And also he was given money as well by his key families.
But the Cloptons were also Grand Masters of the Guild of the Holy Cross, which we'll see in the chapel later on. They were behind the construction of not only Stratford but Birmingham, the Inn of Birmingham. So these are very, very important people. And Clopton Hall, just outside of Stratford, has got an interesting history because one of the currents goes through Clopton House, the female current, and there's a well at the back. There's a legend of somebody being murdered in there in the chapel inside Clopton House and dumped in the well. There's all kinds of occult activity around Clopton Hall.
On this feminine current, as we head north out of Stratford, Clopton is and its tower, where the Belinus line goes through. And as I say, Sir Hugh Clopton particularly was he's buried here. He's associated with Shakespeare in that he was a patron, apparently from a very young age, because of course Shakespeare supposedly was brought up here. His father came here as a glover, made a lot of money, became an alderman. He also was a member of the Guild of the Holy Cross, and Sir Hugh Clopton took it upon himself to educate Shakespeare, take him to his great library at Clopton Hall, expose him to all the wonders of the world. There's also talk that he was also paid for him to go on a sort of grand tour of Europe, where he supposedly developed a great knowledge of the sort of things that we see in the plays today, or supported him to buy his house, Place House, which we'll take you to, which is on the feminine current, where Gary mentioned there's an Iron Age settlement just been excavated, which belonged to the Cloptons as well, and that's where Shakespeare ended his days at that house. But yes, going back to Charlotte, she was the blue-eyed, beautiful daughter of the Cloptons, who came down with the plague in the 1600s, and the plague sends you apparently into a catatonic state, and they thought she was dead, put her entombed her here, and sadly she woke up. And it is said when they came to bury another member of the family, 2 years later, they found her decomposing body at the top of the stairs and trying to scratch her way out.
So they used Stratford as a kind of base for their, because they were highly religious people. They were very high Catholic, if you like, and they felt somehow this area being associated with the Holy Cross. It was a Catholic shrine. Although there's very little evidence of it, there is kind of crumbs of evidence, which we've been, including that statue on the pulpit there, on the far right, is now in the middle. You see him went to Rome, found the relics of Christ and brought them back to Britain with the true cross and the nails. And when you go into the Guild Chapel later on, you'll see the life of St. Helen through her, including her finding the relics and bringing them back. I've never seen that in any other place before, but it's laid out in the Guild Chapel, so it was important to this guild, the story of the Holy Cross and the nails. So, and of course the Holy Cross and nails have disappeared. Some say they were buried in Wales, some say buried in other places. But,
so what does it really mean then, the Holy Cross? A crossing of...
With the cross, you see the cross...
Perhaps crossing of
the cross of stars, the Northern Cross. Everybody in the old days used to know what the Northern Cross was, and that was the stars of Cygnus. So the cross of the north may have something to do with this. So the Cloptons were obsessed also with this worship of the Northern Cross, the cross of Helen, because in some star charts they show the image of Helen holding the cross over Cygnus. So Helen and the cross, as you see over there, represents Cygnus. So perhaps the Cloptons and the Guild of the Holy Cross, who were responsible for building these pillars in this old part, were mirroring Cygnus as well. Because Cygnus was believed to be a star system where souls go to and come from. So a birth and rebirth sort of place, vortex, portal. Yes, portal to the old world.
And of course, if you understand the star system, Cygnus is right in front of the Milky Way. So it's actually overlaid over the Milky Way. And then behind the Milky Way, if you take the gases out the way, you've got our central star of our galaxy right behind. So in a way, knowing that, then the ancients felt that that's where we were born from and where we went back to. So that's why Cygnus was so important to them to honour and focus on.
And if you see the Milky Way as a river, as the ancients did, and saw the Avon as the Milky Way, then where it floods and becomes a patch is almost identical to what you see in the Milky Way above. The black area is like a flooding part of the river. So in some ways, the obsession here with the swan, even Shakespeare was called the swan, is something to do with, we think, the underlying worship of the stars of Cygnus, which these people were all about. And there's a lot of history in these Cloptons that was still to come to the surface.
Well, wool merchant.
Wool merchant, yeah. But if you go in the Guild Chapel, you'll see him portrayed there. So he was an important man himself, part of this great line of people. So, it makes you wonder whether it was all set up.
Because there were some theories saying he was a spy. Place House in Hampshire, which is where Shakespeare went a lot and apparently wrote some of his plays and performed them, and where the School of Night would meet. And most of their principles were based on the Hermetic principles that was introduced by Cosmo Medici during the 1500s. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff around Shakespeare that's been written by many people. Graham Phillips, colleague of Andrew Collins, he's written quite a lot about and researched, looked at the actual records about Shakespeare and questioned why he was just mentioned as a gent in the death registers, where his son-in-law was mentioned as a great merchant and a successful trader, but why did Shakespeare, why was he just mentioned as a gent? Whereas, Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson, they were all mentioned as great playwrights.
To the north, the Ley runs through the chapel of the Guild of the Holy Cross in Stratford, then on to St Mary's Church, Langley. This has a stained glass window with a legend that a window donated to the church contains a secret code concerning the whereabouts of lost Templar treasure. To the south, it goes through the 19th century church of St Mary at Atherton-on-Stour, built to replace a medieval church. It's now redundant and converted into a private house. The aerial view shows that the churchyard appears to be pentagonal. The Ley then goes on to the 4 Shire stone near Morton in the Marsh, put where Gloucestershire, Warwickshire, Oxfordshire and Worcestershire meet. It's said that it inspired the 3 farthing stone in The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien.
When we were following Ellen from the church through that unusual feature, she passes through the corner of this rotunda building here, and then crosses the road through this other place theatre, which is kind of like a metal construction made of iron, which was at the time a cheap way of building a theatre. And then it carries on to the Guild of the Holy Cross Chapel. And years later I realised that with the cross of Cygnus laid over Stratford, with the Guild Chapel in the middle and the church at the bottom, the other star that forms the cross of Cygnus in between fell upon the other place theatre. So we had a look at the significance of that, and it was built with the inspiration of this lady here. She died young. We'll get into that in a bit.
Yeah.
But it was her idea to build a theatre for the ordinary people, because the elitism of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre was very strong in those days, and only the wealthy could really go and enjoy the theatre. The ordinary people just couldn't afford to go. So Buzz Goodbody built a theatre for the common people to give them Shakespeare's knowledge. So in a way she was like continuing with the Cygnus energy, and a goddess in her own right.
Because not only did she create this wonderful theatre, she was a woman at a time when really the theatre was still dominated by men in the hierarchy, in the management. And so she became a producer and director and a playwright. They called it the Courtyard Theatre for a time, and everybody had to go there. And now it's reopened here. This closed, but now it's reopened as an exhibition place. Apparently the RSC do a lot of rehearsals here. People can come in and engage with theatre world, and there's a lovely cafe in there as well.
The theatre here is one of the stars of Cygnus, which if you overlay it over Stratford's sacred site, having the church and the Guild Chapel as the 2 main stars. The Guild Chapel in the middle of the Swan, you see the Swan here, with the wings and the head being
Holy Trinity Church.
The other star, the cross here, falls exactly on the round rotunda of the theatre there, and that represents, if you like, the original Globe Theatre in London, where the original plays were performed. Originally stood as a round rotunda, and it was added to, and it's called the Swan Theatre. So on the stars of the Swan has on one of its stars the Swan Theatre, and the mail current leaves the church, comes across the river, and then cuts through. Cloptons were masters here, with the wife, Agnes, wife of John Clopton there in the window. Hugh Clopton was the most famous of the Cloptons, who became Mayor of London. So from this little town in the Midlands, so many famous people came out of this guild. So it had to be more than just a little guild in a little town. There must be something important about Stratford, all these people, all this guild. we discovered that every now and again on Christmas, every other year sometimes, Prince Charles himself actually comes to play in here on Christmas Eve. So think about that, the royal connection here, that's incredible. That he must know something about the importance of this place. It's come on such a significant day. These are some of the most famous people of the Guild.
And also Edward VI as well. Interesting that he was a member.
He was one that granted the charter.
Yeah.
Did John Shakespeare move in normal circles, or he was a trader, like a merchant, but he must have come into contact with people of...
Well, look how he's dressed. He's dressed in the regal sort of robes, the purple robes. He's more than just a glover. You know, but the story tells us that he was just a simple man. But this chapel, this guild, says a different story about John Shakespeare. That he was far more important than...
Why would they spread that story then? That he was just, you know, a trader and merchant.
It's propaganda, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Typical propaganda.
These two men as well, John of Stratford and Robert of Stratford, are two key members.
There are lots of little clues in here, and the paintings that were around the wall, that once displayed on these walls, were actually magnificent. One of them is showing St. George. Of course, we know about we're talking about the St. George parades that became the Shakespeare parades, because they went to the same, started from the birthplace and ended at the death place of Shakespeare. We're actually doing this sort of pilgrimage the other way around. We're going from the death place to the rebirth place, if you like.
And these are the wonderful tapestries of St. Helen, bringing on tour the cross, the Holy Rood.
Finding the true cross. And the nails as well, they're such
Who would gainsay that though? You know, if she authenticated them, nobody'd have the nerve to go against them, would they?
No, and she was a very powerful queen in her time. Constantine was one of the great, kings of Europe at the time. So,
was that the Helen that was born in this country, or was that the mother?
She was supposed to be Welsh, wasn't she?
Born in this country, though?
Yeah, she was the mother of Constantine.
Yeah.
English.
British, yeah. She could well be Welsh, I'm not sure. Some stories say she was Welsh. So yeah, imagine Prince Charles coming here at Christmas Eve. That's a great story. But there's also an oversized dragon that is shown on the wall here as a mural. At the back there, you'll see some displays showing you what some of the pictures were like, murals. So have a look at those, they're interesting. Look at some of the other symbolism around here. And
for those who love that connection with Cygnus, we are at the very centre of the Cygnus layout that's overlaid on the town.
Centre of the cross.
Very centre of the body of the swan. The symbolism from these pictures of the cross.
So if anybody's confused what they're looking at here, that's the neck of the head of the swan, the neck, the two wings and the tail. Deneb is in the tail. And Deneb is the most important, it's the largest star of the constellation, and that falls exactly on the old town square. And the old town square used to be a circular area that we'll go and look at later on, because it became ignored by local people. They turned it into a kind of horrendous 1970s shopping area.
Which you'll see.
And they built a new town square in Victorian times further up. So they took away the heart of Stratford in some ways. We discovered a lot of the old towns that were the most prosperous, the ones that kept their central focal point. Those who have moved their centres and kind of done away with the quartering. And each quarter of that city had certain qualities where certain people would live in it. The kings and royals would live in the north east quadrant. The northwest quadrant was the people, the class people, trade people, and ordinary people would live in the southeast and southwest quarters, and the wells and the springs were from the southeast. Now every culture has different ideas of what should be in those quadrants, like the Feng Shui, the Chinese Feng Shui and the Celtic Feng Shui. But they did stick to a kind of ancient plan that was first laid out by Plato and then continued through into, we believe, into the Iron Age, and then the earliest cities with a circular sort of earthworks around.
And if you, I was going to say, if you remember the talk that Gary gave at the Oxford Moot, for those who were there, he talked about Oxford still having that layout very much so in its centre.
Bridport in Dorset, they've got north, east,
yes,
south.
exactly.
And that's Brideport.
Yes, it is.
Yes. Yeah, we're going to do a talk about Bridport and its connections with Bride and the north, south, east, west. Bridport used to be called Bruteport before the name was changed in the 17th century. The earliest records talk about it as Bruteport, so it's a port of Brutus.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting connection because it's supposed to have landed at Totnes and then come along the coast. And Bridport would have been a stop-off place port towards London. So I don't know, there's lots of interesting connections there. But Brut also has to do with Bride and the goddess, which was worshipped in the Iron Age. So it's honouring the centre, finding the centre and honouring it and keeping a perpetual flame and a goddess connection is very important to the harmony of the land, to keep that harmony going, rather like perpetual choirs. The Christian aspect of keeping the sort of harmonious flow of energy through the land demonstrated by having this kind of a cycle of chanting, if you like. But in ancient times it was done from the central point by the goddess figure. And if you look at Bride, I don't know if I didn't have time to point out Bride in the church, but Bride's there with these flames coming out of her head, which is to do with Bridget, of course, and the perpetual flame of Bridget still lit in Ireland. And that's not a Sumerian sort of concept, it's actually an Indian. And I don't mean Indian as we know it today, but in India, in the Vedas, in the very ancient times, in fact the origins of the Aryan race come from that continent more. And I think there's a lot of conspiracy now looking at Sumeria and Turkey as the actual cradle of civilization, but everything around the ancient culture of Ireland smacks of India, because the stone of destiny, all these, the Truro stone, they're all rounded altar stones that are phallus, they're linga stones basically. And the round towers are found more in India than anywhere else, and the concept's supposed to be an Aryan concept of the round tower. And so many ancient Irish historians have written on the connections in names and places to India. Worshipping, honouring the well is something very important to do with the healing of all towns and places. So the head star, the major star of the Deneb Swan figure, which is in the tail of the swan, Deneb, falls upon the Old Town Square exactly on this plan that the Cloptons obviously worked out to sort of mirror as above, so below. The Old Town Square was the old heart of Stratford, where people would meet, congregate, trade, public announcements. All those things happened in the town square. And here was an old Elizabethan town square.
Marked by a cross.
Marked by a cross in the middle, and possibly a well, which we often found in all the centres of all the layouts. Well, this, unfortunately, is since they've taken the square away and replaced it with a Victorian hideous square further up here. Stratford as a town has done well out of Shakespeare, but the actual town itself hasn't prospered. It's only prospered from Shakespeare's trade. But the actual local shops have not done well here. And this place here was badly designed. And everybody who rented a shop in this Old Town Square fell on hard times. And the first time we dowsed it going through here, we felt our energy is quite small. There's lots of drunks and down and outs here in the evening. It was kind of a dark centre of Stratford. So its heart centre became a dark centre. But the female dragon also comes through and passes through a shop that 4 shops have done here. But somebody, for some reason, one day, and this is before our book was published, I was showing people the current going through the corner of the shop, and in the shop window there was an inflatable green dragon, or something blown up. But it was a parody of the feminine, because it was a green dragon but with big red lipstick, fat lips, long blonde hair, and it was kind of like a mocking of the feminine, which is going through this sort of down and out area. So it's just a coincidence, but it was the kind of collective consciousness showing itself in a way. But when I brought another group back next time, it had gone. Instead of going through Shakespeare's birthplace, she goes through these bushes here, at an angle through the gardens, crosses the road, and then disappears behind houses, and then reappears at the Masonic Hall, which is hidden away in a kind of recess. But when we were dowsing around the houses there, we came across the Stratford's Masonic Hall. So Ellen's connected with that element of the Masons again. And then further up, she heads up towards Clopton House and the haunted well we spoke about before, the cursed well, the Clopton estate. So why is she going through these bushes and this land instead of the house? So it's perhaps because there's something ancient here, I feel. For those of you who can douse, you might want to check that it just misses the house. Energies find you out if you try and make it up somehow. So you just have to be double check. We often douse things first of all. They can come back a year later and douse it all again. And we then discovered you have to do it 3 times to be sure that you're not being distracted by anything, having a bad day. So after the 3rd time of dowsing it, we discovered, sure enough, Ellen just flowed through this part of the garden. So this was Shakespeare's birthplace. But was it? I mean, there's no actual evidence or written evidence that this was Shakespeare's birthplace. It was just always known as Shakespeare's birthplace as local tradition. So it maybe had something to do with the Cloptons as well, because they had all this estate. But possibly it might have something to do with a Clopton house, of which, you know, Shakespeare was a fabrication of the Cloptons. Or they used a child of one of the Grand Masters in Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, as a figurehead to front their
Stories.
Yeah, it's their propaganda in some ways. So Ellen then ends her journey through Stratford at Clopton House, and then we can have a look at the male journey, which is also interesting. Karen, Adam?
No, I just think it's interesting, isn't it, that we come from, as you say, Ellen connects with his place of death and his place of sacred birth.
Yes. Yes, and also, you know, the parade, the Shakespeare parade starts here, works its way up to, and ends at the death place. So every single point of the stars of Cygnus has a place of power, including these 3 stars here, which fall exactly, the end star falls upon the Swan's nesting ground, which is across the bridge in no man's land. It's a little island where all the swans seem to congregate and give birth, and that falls upon the last star of the Swan, where the swans give birth. It's absolutely perfect. Anybody wants to try it?
That's where they got quite a big car park.
Giving birth. Yeah, well, yeah.
Where people come into that house.
It's just the other side of the straight ford, by the straight ford across the Clopton Bridge. So when we were following the mail current, after the mail current leaves, comes through the dragon tree, the mulberry tree, in Place House Garden, he then cuts through Sheep Street through this house called Shreve's House, and it's the most haunted house in Stratford. And it was linked to the history of the Shreve, the archer of Henry VIII.
Yeah.
The most haunted house.
And
So-
you can go in there after hours on a kind of most haunted tour.
Which we did.
And,
Scary.
but we were there to douse the Bleaners
Hilarious.
currents while everybody else was trying to summon up spirits. We were there trying to summon
Yeah,
up
we were
Bleaners.
dowsing in the dark with all these wax, figures sort of looming out at you.
But it's one of the oldest houses in Stratford,
Yes.
so we're going to have a look at that now.
It's-
Eleanor's line, the mail current comes up this pathway here, partly into the Shreve's house, one of the oldest houses in Stratford. Interestingly, these are proper cobbles from the original Tudor street. It's the only original surface left from those times in the whole town. And some of them are made of granite, but these are original Tudor cobbles. So and Shakespeare used to come and meet with, there's a tavern at the back here. One of his friends used to meet with, and one of the stories, we've got his name, the tavern owner.
Ben Johnson.
No, he wasn't a poet or a play actor, he was a resident tavern owner. And Shakespeare used to come and drink here, so it's said that Shakespeare had walked up and down these cobbles many, many times. But this is the place that they say is the most haunted house in Stratford inside. That's said to be old, quite old, at least Victorian, maybe earlier. We don't know who put them there. When I questioned the guide here, he said that the coven, witches' covens, used to meet here, which is interesting because the power of the mail currents is also probably being used for some kind of ritual here. So this is a kind of a cult centre of Stratford.
And also it was the house of the many Lord Mayors. Yeah,
It was a Lord Mayor's house as well, in times gone by. So it was a very, very important house. The Lord Mayor, of course, would have the best house in the town. So this was part of that huge house. Anything else?
Do you remember the dragons?
Well, they're griffins, I guess,
Yeah.
but the bell current comes right through those two winged griffin creatures as it comes up.
Someone
here.
was inspired putting them
Yeah, someone was inspired putting there. This chapel that has the most unusual frontage because it's the Baptist chapel, and it has this amazing Greek front with the great pillars like a Greek temple, and it's a very masculine Apollo-like temple. So it seemed very appropriate that it goes through there, and then it carries on towards the obelisk at Clopton House.
Coming through.
Yep. So, what we're going to do now is go into the Bancroft Gardens again, to the Shakespeare Monument, and I'm going to show you where the swans give birth on this little island, and where the stars fall on that side. Symbolism on that memorial to do with Shakespeare's life and other things connected with the occult. So, we're going to have a look at that after. But yeah, just to show you that's Swan Island, where all the swans give birth, where the heron is. This right by the ford.
Yes.
Because yesterday afternoon there was a marquee out there, and there were massive Indian people.
With visions of some kind of green stone that was brought across to this country in prehistoric times from ancient Egypt, and it was prized out of the crown of Akhenaten at his death in Amarna, and the stone, with some of the followers of Aten, the sun god, came to the British Isles, which then were the Isles of Amenta, the Isles of the Blessed, the Isles of the Goddess, the Isles of the God's own goddess. And these people followed the Phoenician routes to come into Britain, and they deposited the energy from this great stone into places along this, we discovered along alignments, because this book was written in the 70s, long before Hamish Miller and Paul Broadhurst had dowsed the Michael and Mary lines. But it turned out that the places where they retrieved the energy back to this stone after they'd found it came out of node points along the Michael line and the Bleaners line, because Wayland Smithy, Uffington, a loop of the Avon, known as the Swan's Neck. And it's said that Mary, Queen of Scots, was the keeper of this stone. and that the stone was put into hiding when Mary Queen of Scots was of course arrested and eventually murdered, but or executed.
Same thing.
Same thing. But the followers of Mary became the gunpowder plotters. So Catesby, the very man who lived on the Spine of Albion, who met with the Cloptons, who were financed by the Cloptons, had this green stone in his possession before he buried it, because he got word that they got wind, the government got wind of the plotters, so he buried the stone in the Swan.
The ley found by Alfred Watkins that passes through the rollright stones and the King's Stone, which we visited on the Oxford Moot, also goes to Stratford and was found to be a 10-church ley, as well as going through the stone circle. A number of these churches are also visited by the Spine of Albion currents, and the ley crosses the Holy Trinity Guild Chapel ley at Atherton-on-Stour. In 1059, King Edward the Confessor granted land at Northmoor to St. Denis Abbey in Paris. Northmoor was made a separate parish in the 12th century, and the parish church of St. Denis was then built. Nothing survives of the original building except the font, which is Norman. The earliest part of the present church on the same site is 13th century. South Lea was not mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086, but was recorded in 1190 as Stanton Lega. The Church of St. James the Great began as a chapel of the parish of Stanton Harcourt and remained so until 1868. The oldest part of the church building date from the latter part of the 12th century. St. Mary's Church at Chipping Norton is also visited by the Belinus current, which is coincident with the ley part of the way to Rollright, though it then has a slight twist. The church has 12th century foundations, but the present building is 13th century. The ley and the current also go through the nearby Castle Mound. From the King's Men Stone Circle towards the King's Stone along the Alfred Watkins ley. The King's Stone at Rollright. Alfred Watkins ley going to Chipping Norton Church goes through this stone and the Rollright Circle at King's Men. Long Compton is mentioned in the famous legendary Witches' Rhyme of Rollright and is famous for its tales of witches. Several carvings inside the church, including that of a woman with a horned headdress, attest to the occult mystery which surrounds the village. Ellen passes through the east side of the church. The Watkins ley also goes through another small church in the village and a coincident road. Tidmington Church, of unknown dedication, dates to about 1200. The ley then goes through the church at Atherton-on-Stour, where it meets Ellen again, and the Holy Trinity Guild Chapel ley. The next point on the line is the 13th century church of St. Helen at Clifford Chambers. The Ellen current also passes through this church in a roughly north-south direction. The dragon gargoyle on the tower marks the entry point for the Ellen current. The Ellen current runs north to south across the nave, and the Alfred Watkins ley is roughly coincident with it. It runs, the Ellen current is dowsable for the whole length of the church, but it's strongest over the chancel arch. It's known that the moated manor house at Clifford Chambers was visited in the 16th century by several well-known poets of the time, such as Michael Drayton, Ben Jonson and Shakespeare. The ley discovered by Lawrence Main in Oxfordshire, that goes through the sites associated with Sir Winston Churchill, continues towards Stratford, passing through 3 more churches on the Ellen current, and finally going through Anne Hathaway's cottage. Churchill's Warrior ley, found by Lawrence Main. This goes through a crossroads in Enstone, then through Blenheim Palace, where Sir Winston Churchill was born, after passing through Ditchley Gate and long stretches of coincident track in the grounds, and the Column of Victory and the Grand Bridge. It then goes through St. Martin's Bladen, where Churchill was buried, and skirts the western edge of Round Castle on Bladen Heath. Then it passes through St. Thomas's Church near Oxford Station, the Lake Street centre, and the site of a wood henge on the Big Rings cursus near Dorchester-on-Thames. After leaving Blenheim Palace, the lay goes through a crossroads with a milestone at Enstone and a farm called Leys Farm, before travelling on to the Church of All Saints at Honington. This has a 13th century tower attached to a 17th century Baroque building. Ellen passes diagonally through it, coincident with the Churchill lay, taking in the sculptured marble monuments to the Parker and Townsend families. The lay continues coincident with Ellen till it reaches the church of St Gregory the Great at Treddington. The first church here was Saxon, and there are remnants of it in the building. It also has a circular churchyard with a ditch and bank. Ellen passes through it diagonally, coincident with the lay again. Gregory the Great was the Pope who instructed St Augustine not to destroy pagan temples but convert them into churches. Watkins quotes this as a possible reason for churches occurring on leys. The lay then proceeds to Stratford, where it goes through Anne Hathaway's cottage, childhood home of Shakespeare's wife. A further lay was found, which comes from the Lake Street Lay Centre in Oxford and goes to the Guild Chapel in Stratford. This also goes through two other churches associated with Ellen. The Lake Street Lay Centre. The centre is at the junction of Lake Street and Summerfield. At present it seems to be completely unmarked. It gives a dowsing reaction of spinning rods. This lay goes through the main crossroads in Burcott and is then coincident with the A423 to the Golden Balls crossroads, continuing to the Norman church of Sandford-on-Thames, where Lewis Carroll once preached. It then goes on to the Lake Street Lay Centre. The next point on the line, where it meets the Ellen Current, is the medieval church of St Mary at Halford, where the Foss Way crosses a ford. Carvings on the internal pillars may date back to Saxon times. By the river are the earthworks and buried remains of Halford Castle, a motte castle believed to be the predecessor of the present manor house. It then goes on to the ruined chapel in the next village of Ettington, running coincident with Ellen. Shakespeare was part of the social scene here and included one of the Shirley family, the owners of Ettington Hall, in Henry IV. Ellen passes diagonally through the chapel tower. It then reaches the Guild Chapel at Stratford, crossing it approximately at right angles to the Ellen Current. The line finally goes through the United Reformed Church, presumably subconsciously sighted. Dowsing round the quaint village of Luddington, Gary found the male current avoiding the church and crossing the main street to an unusual old cottage. Luck was on their side as they spotted the owner coming out of the front door, so they quickly approached her and asked if she knew anything about the history of her home. Well, it was a blacksmith's forge for a time, she replied, but before this it was a chapel built in Norman times. She added, legend says Shakespeare was married Anne Hathaway here. Remarkably, the guidebook at the Victorian All Saints Parish Church, built to replace the old chapel, confirmed her story. It would seem that the church at Luddington was subconsciously sighted, as there appears to be a lay going from it through the site of the old chapel. This continues on to Anne Hathaway's cottage, where it meets the Churchill lay. Then it goes on to Clopton House, home of the Clopton family associated with Shakespeare, where it meets the Ellen Current. It then goes through a major crossroads in Warwick and along half a mile of coincident track to the Church of All Saints at Leek Wootton. A church has stood on this site since the 12th century, and the church website mentions the possibility of a pagan temple here. Most of it was rebuilt in 1789, but there is a 12th century tapered font and some medieval tiles. The Belinus current flows through the Market Cross in Henley-in-Arden, where we saw purple and yellow flowers, the colours of the female and male currents. Belinus goes on from here to the church of St John the Baptist at Henley. The original church here was built in 1397, and the present building is 15th century. About 700 yards away, and on the Ellen current, is the church of St Nicholas, Beaudesert, at the foot of the linear hill known as the Mount, which Lawrence sees as one of the many sleeping goddess figures which exist in various parts of the country. The hill once held a Norman castle, which was excavated by time team. The dig revealed substantial walls of a great hall, and finds included coloured window glass, glazed floor tiles, and a silver penny. A lay through the two churches goes on to the remains of the small priory of Cistercian nuns at Pinley, founded in the time of Henry I and dissolved by Henry VIII. The priory wall can be seen to the right of the farm building. The lay continues to the church at Long Itchington, which was originally built in the 12th century. It originally had a spire, but a lightning strike in the 18th century demolished it, and all that's left is a stump in the tower.